Good evening. Welcome to the Rollins Museum of Art. I'm Dr. Gisela Carbonell, curator here at the RMA, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker. But before I do that, I kindly ask that you please silence your phone. Thank you. Tonight's event is being live streamed and recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel later, so you can revisit and share with those who couldn't be here tonight. We also want to welcome our virtual visitors. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight's event is made possible by the Thomas P. Johnson Distinguished Visiting Scholars and Artists Program, and it is related, of course, to the exhibition Portrait of a Movement, a New Approach to the Bloomsbury Group. The exhibition opened earlier this year, and it has been so successful that we have decided to extend it one more season. And so it will be on view through May 10th of this coming year. Following Dr. Hitchmough's presentation, there will be time for Q&A. And although we close tonight right after the presentation at 7, but now you know the exhibition will be up for several more months, so you can come back after this lecture to see the works in a new light. This exhibition presents the museum's collection of Bloomsbury Group works in a new light and from a new perspective. It is informed by recent scholarship, includes significant new acquisitions, and it provides context for the group's artistic work while also considering their complex relationships and interesting biographies. Our guest speaker, Dr. Wendy Hitchmough, is emeritus senior lecturer at the University of Sussex and was curator at Charleston Modernist Home and Studio of the painters Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant for over 12 years. Dr. Hitchmough served as head of historic buildings and research at historic royal palaces and is author of The Bloomsbury Look, published in 2020, and Vanessa Bell, The Life and Art of a Bloomsbury Radical, published this year, both of them by Yale University Press. Please welcome Dr. Wendy Hitchmough.
Well, Gisela, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you here at the Rollins Museum this evening. That's a great honor for me and a great pleasure. In particular, I would like to thank Mariah and Austin for all their help and encouragement with my research into the Bloomsbury artists and the paintings in particular in the Rollins collection. I was trained as an art historian to look at paintings, and I wonder how many art historians there are in the room. Can you put your hand up if you're an art historian? I thought there might be a few of you. That's lovely. And then I worked as a curator at Charleston, and I learned how to tell stories. I learned to group pictures and objects together to create a compelling narrative. And those stories change over time. And as a painting moves from private collection to public museum, from permanent collection to exhibition, the stories that we tell about it also change. Each new context gives us an opportunity to look again. So it's stories that I want to focus on this evening. And I'm going to look in detail at two of the paintings in this exhibition and to see how far we can shift the narratives about both of them. The first is, as you see here, Vanessa Bell's portrait of Mary Hutchinson. And the strapline here is that this is a portrait by Vanessa of her husband's lover. You can see she didn't like her very much, can't you? Okay, so that is an irresistible line because it makes us laugh. And I'm sure there is an element of truth in it. But I'm going to come back to that story and complicate it for you. I will argue that this is a painting about Vanessa and Mary as radical women. It's about rule breaking. It's about modernism. But first, I want to look in detail at Summer in the Garden by Roger Fry. And it's such a pleasure to be in the room with that painting. So as all of you know, the painting was recently acquired by the Rollins Museum. And the story that they were told by the art dealer, Philip Mould, who sold it, was that this is a love story. Philip Mould believed that the portrait was painted at Roger Fry's home near Guildford in Surrey. The house is called Durbin's, and it was painted in the summer of 1911. It was a love story because Vanessa and Roger had embarked on a love affair a few months earlier. And you can watch a video on YouTube of Philip telling that story. Roger had invented the term post-impressionist the previous year. So he invented the term post-impressionist when he organized a groundbreaking exhibition, Manet and the Post-Impressionists, at the Grafton Gallery in London. And this painting, Philip claimed, was post-impressionist because of its use of color and because the woman's face is simplified. It has no features. Well, that's a nice story, particularly if you have a painting to sell. And some of it is true. This is indeed a portrait of Vanessa Bell, and it was painted in the garden at Durbin's by Roger Fry, but it wasn't painted in 1911. I will argue that it was painted in the autumn of 1918, towards the end of the First World War, and that it represents a very different and more complex love story. The first time I saw Summer in the Garden, it was on loan to Charleston. And I knew immediately that it was painted in 1918 rather than 1911. And I said so because Vanessa is clearly pregnant in this painting. There are stylistic reasons too that make 1911 an improbable date for this as a painting by Roger Fry. And then there is that orange jacket. When I was told that the Rollins Museum had acquired the painting, we agreed that I might look a little deeper into its story to find out when exactly it was painted and what the circumstances surrounding it might have been. Art historians are trained first and foremost to look, and I still quite often stand in front of a painting in a museum or at an exhibition, and I write down exactly what I see, starting with the most obvious things. I don't know whether you're still trained to work in galleries in that way with your notebook or your laptop. So then, this is quite a large painting compared, for example, with Vanessa Bell's innovative portrait of Virginia Woolf, painted in 1912. You need to stand back to take in Summer in the Garden, whereas Vanessa's portrait of her sister draws you in close, and the intimacy of that portrait is accentuated by its small scale. So it's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's about this big. So you go right in close to it when you're looking at it. And what do we see in Summer in the Garden? It's a painting of a woman sitting upright in a deck chair in a garden. Facing her is an empty chair, and she is absorbed in stitching or studying a long length of vibrant green and gold cloth. She's dressed in a striking combination of orange jacket, blue dress, mauve stockings, and burgundy-coloured shoes. Not an obvious combination. There's a ridge of blue beneath the bust here. And so when you see, here's the bust, and then here is the pregnant belly. And we're looking into the light. So that the source of light's really interesting and important in the painting. So Roger's portrait is also a study in light and shade. We're looking into the light so that it catches the profile of Vanessa's famous aquiline nose in a sweeping stroke of pale pink paint. And it also catches her forehead and neck. And you'll have an opportunity to actually look at the painting, and you can see, I was wondering whether Roger Fry started that sweep of pink. My pointer again here, whether he starts at the tip of the nose and works up, and then it slightly dashes back in. And I think he starts at the tip, and then as he presses down with the brush, it releases more paint. The stroke thickens, and then he flicks it back. The use of light accentuates the bold orange of Vanessa's left shoulder and her arm, and it falls across the yellow and green fabric on the ground. So that Fry's use of colour in the portrait, contrasting the exuberance of this figure and her work with the dark tones of evergreen foliage in the background, is one of the portrait's strengths. You would walk across a gallery to look at it. And I'm looking at it now, so it absolutely stings out at you like a beacon. Beyond looking at the painting itself, there are other sources of information about it that we work with as art historians. So sometimes the Bloomsbury artists signed and dated their paintings, but they were not always so obliging. Sometimes they wrote about them and even included sketches of them in their letters to one another. Stories are often passed down with the pictures from one owner to the next, and these can be partly true, partly wishful sometimes. A good story enhances the value of a painting. And also the provenance of a painting often tells us a lot about it. So this painting, for example, that I show you here, signed and dated by Vanessa in 1920 and originally exhibited with the title The Party, is believed to have belonged to Virginia Woolf. By the time it was sold by a dealer in 1983, it had acquired a new title, Mrs. Dalloway's Party. Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, wasn't published until 1925, so the painting predated even the first concept of that novel. One scholar has suggested that the figure on the left was Mary Hutchinson, who was famous for her parties, and I'm going to talk more about her later. But whatever the truth may be about this painting, all of these stories are factors in the way that we read it. I don't know how Summer in the Garden became associated with the beginning of Roger's affair with Vanessa and dated 1911 accordingly, but the evidence is against this reading. So I show you here on the left a photograph of Vanessa Bell taken around the time of her marriage in 1907, and on the right, one taken by Roger at Durbin's in 1911. Roger had accompanied Vanessa and her husband, Clive Bell, together with another of their friends, Harry Norton, on a trip to Turkey in 1911. The friendship between the two artists intensified as they sketched together outdoors. When Vanessa suffered a miscarriage in a remote Turkish village, Roger nursed her back to health, and they fell in love. Vanessa was 31 at the time, and Roger was 44. Clive Bell was many things, but a sympathetic nurse was not one of them, and so Vanessa spent time at Durbin's with Roger, recuperating when they returned to the UK. Vanessa had two sons, Quentin and Julian, who were 1 and 3 years old that summer. So we can't tell from this black and white photograph on the right what colours she was wearing in 1911, but her dress and jewellery beneath the shawl and her hat suggest that she was still quite fashionably dressed, as she is on the left, as an Edwardian lady. There's evidence here of lace and frills that are stripped away in Summer in the Garden. I'm going to come back to questions of dress, but before I do so, let's look at two other portraits of Vanessa by Roger that are also believed to have been painted in that summer of 1911. These two sketches, one painted onto the front and the other onto the back of the same board, are smaller and very different in style to Summer in the Garden. They describe the acute mental illness that Vanessa suffered after her miscarriage. Roger wrote to their friend, Lady Ottilie Morrell, "What really alarms me is the state of mental terror which she gets into, as though everything was slipping away from her." His own wife had been consigned to a mental institution the previous year, and he recommended that Vanessa see a leading psychiatrist, Dr. Maurice Craig. She continued to suffer with her mental health for several years afterwards. So Roger's treatment in these sketches of Vanessa's hands describe her distress. She's dishevelled in the paintings, her legs are showing, and the image of her stretching in the grass, her face flushed, suggests sexual desire or satisfaction. These are sketches, But both images detail Vanessa's features. In the image above, she appears to be wearing a high-necked white blouse and the purple shawl that we see again discarded at her feet in the image below. They're compatible with her clothing in the photograph, although the red skirt prefigures the bold colours in Summer in the Garden. And stylistically, it seems unlikely that these sketches were made in the same summer as Summer in the Garden. As Vanessa recovered, she and Roger experimented together with post-impressionism in their paintings. They were both inspired by portraits by Cézanne and Van Gogh and by pointillist paintings that Roger had shown in Manet and the Post-Impressionists. And they often worked together, side by side. So here are their portraits of Virginia Woolf, Vanessa's sister. And we know that these were painted around 1912 because Vanessa painted Virginia again in the same grey jacket with its band of green around the neck and the cuffs on two further occasions, each time abstracting the details of her face. And I've just shown you one of those portraits a few minutes ago. But stylistically, Roger's portrait experiments with the simplification of her features, and yet her features are exaggerated in this portrait of her. He's been exploring the aesthetics of Byzantine mosaics and of post-impressionist portraits by Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Matisse. Roger painted Vanessa repeatedly, including this intimate portrait on the left of her reclining. And they shared an interest in artistic dress. In fact, Vanessa designed and made many of her own clothes, and in 1915, she designed a dress collection for the Omega workshops. Green stockings in 1912 were enough of a novelty for Vanessa to write to a friend about them when she bought them from Debenhams. And she wrote to Roger in June 1912, "I have got myself a new coat, a long blue cloth one for everyday wear, with a large white triangle in front." It's likely to have been one of the fitted full-length overgarments that were fashionable that summer. And she wears it here on the right in her self-portrait at the easel. Roger painted her wearing it with her green stockings in this intimate portrait of her sleeping. And you see here that he paints a little V on the sole of her shoe, a V for Vanessa. And they're both dated around 1912. Well, the following year, Vanessa and Roger co-founded the Omega Workshops in London with Duncan Grant. And the Omega Workshops was a shop with a design studio. It employed innovative young contemporary artists to design and make products. They worked part-time on a freelance basis so that they could earn enough money to carry on with their painting. And the Omega applied the principles of post-impressionism to the decorative arts. So here you see a post-impressionist room exhibited by the Omega at the Ideal Homes exhibition in London. And the Ideal Homes exhibition is the sort of the big domestic show that everybody would crowd into London to go to. It's not an art show in any sense of the word. And these panels here and here and here, one painted by Roger, one painted by Vanessa, one painted by Duncan Grant, and then these full-length curtains. This is a fabric designed by Vanessa called Maud, and here another of her fabrics designed for the Omega Workshops called White. The armchair is covered with a fabric that's designed by Roger Fry. So the Omega Workshops made a significant contribution to design history, but it was disastrous for the relationship between Roger and Vanessa. At first, it was exciting. They designed textiles together, and they persuaded a potter to show them how to model bowls and plates in clay. But later, Vanessa wrote to Roger that the Omega had changed things a good deal between them. She wrote, and I quote, "It meant that I saw much more of you, and in a very exasperating way." As their relationship cooled, she found herself falling in love with Duncan. While Roger used his family money to invest in the Omega workshops, and he took on the role of directing operations, Vanessa and Duncan focused on designing products and on painting together. They worked so closely that their paintings and designs would become almost indistinguishable. By February 1915, when they first painted Mary Hutchinson, Duncan and Vanessa were lovers, and Roger out in the cold. He took a break from the Omega, leaving Vanessa to manage the workshops while he went to France, where he joined his sister in the war relief work that she was doing with the Quakers. Well, almost all of the Bloomsbury friends were pacifists, and their opposition to the war was one of the factors that held them together as a group. When conscription was introduced, some of the men in the group were examined and discharged from active service on medical grounds, and the others had to defend their rights as conscientious objectors at tribunal hearings. Bloomsbury was a circle of friends, many of whom had first met as undergraduates at Cambridge University. They clustered around Vanessa and Virginia's brother, Toby Stephen, and when they graduated, Vanessa and Toby invited them to the home that they had set up at 46 Gordon Square in London's Bloomsbury after their parents had died. But then in 1906, Toby died at the age of 26, and the trauma of his death drew the friends more closely together. Vanessa agreed to marry one of Toby's friends, Clive Bell, quite literally on the day of his funeral. And Virginia married another of his friends, Leonard Woolf, a few years later. Although they rejected claims that they were a group in any formal sense, they created a memoir club in 1920. And here it is, painted by Vanessa around 1943. And you see most of the Bloomsbury Group in the painting. So we have Duncan Grant, Leonard Woolf, Angelica, the illegitimate daughter that Vanessa had with Duncan Grant. Vanessa has seated herself here between Duncan Grant and his lover, David Garnett. Duncan Grant was almost exclusively a homosexual. And then here we see Maynard Keynes with his wife, the ballerina Lydia Lopakova, Vanessa Bell's younger son, Quentin, and down in the foreground, E.M. Forster. Sorry if my pointer isn't quite as good as it could be, but I'm squinting to look at that. There are portraits on the wall, and they are of Bloomsbury members who had already died by 1943. So the portraits are of Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, and Roger Fry. As a circle of friends, Bloomsbury supported one another's work. The authors read aloud from their manuscripts when they came down to Charleston, and the painters often shared the same models and still lifes, painting together, shoulder to shoulder. They encouraged one another to innovate. So here we have portraits of Maynard Keynes by Duncan Grant and Roger Fry, painted in the walled garden at Charleston in 1917. They were both painted on the same occasion, and Vanessa too painted Keynes on that day, although the whereabouts of her painting is not known. And it's significant that I think more of Vanessa's paintings were lost than Roger Fry's or Duncan Grant's, and that's because she's a woman. So again, it's interesting to think of this portrait by Roger stylistically in relation to the more abstracted treatment of Vanessa Bell in Summer in the Garden. So I'm going to keep bringing you back to these Roger Fry paintings and think, so is this before or after Summer in the Garden? Maynard Keynes took a job at the Treasury during the war, and he used his status to help Duncan and his lover, David Garnett, who was always known as Bunny, to avoid conscription. He gave evidence on their behalf at their tribunal. Well, Duncan and Maynard had been lovers for a time from 1908, and when Vanessa rented Charleston farmhouse in East Sussex so that Duncan and Bunny could work as agricultural labourers, classified as work of national importance. And so it was appropriate for conscientious objectors to take on that work. Maynard took a room in the house and contributed to the rent. He also took over the lease of Vanessa's London home, 46 Gordon Square, and her husband, Clive, continued to have a room in that house. But Clive didn't move to Charleston until 1939. So really 1916, when Vanessa Bell takes Charleston, is the end of the period when she's living with her husband. The sex lives of Bloomsbury and their living arrangements are complicated. And of course, that's one of the things that makes them so interesting. We have to imagine on this summer day in 1917 that Maynard is working in the garden at Charleston. In fact, he was drafting a telegram to America requesting an essential war loan. He's staying with his former boyfriend, Duncan, and Duncan's current boyfriend, Bunny. Vanessa is the matriarch. She has rented the farmhouse, obtained jobs for the two young men. She manages her two young children, who in 1917 are aged 9 and 7, and she manages a small staff, a cook, a parlour maid, and a governess. She and Duncan are also lovers, and together they're already trying for a baby. Roger comes to stay when he's invited, although he does his best to visit when Duncan is not around. And the three artists are still working together at the Omega workshops. Clive and his lover, Mary, are regular visitors. Virginia and Leonard have a house a few miles away. Can you picture it? I think even by today's standards, it feels rebellious, it feels anarchic. And in 1917, we have to remember that homosexuality in Britain was illegal, so it was risky. When Lytton Strachey visited, Vanessa had to write to ask him to be less obvious about his flirtations with the postboy and the stable boy nearby, because they were gossiped about, particularly by the servants, but also by the locals, and that gossip could cause their landlord to throw them out. Indeed, it could be worse. It could get the two men arrested and thrown into jail. But these intimate relationships were also at the heart of their sense of themselves as pioneers, as modernists rejecting the conventions of their day. When Maynard resigned from the Treasury because he couldn't support the peace treaty negotiations at Versailles, he spent the summer at Charleston in 1919, and it was there that he wrote his iconic Economic Consequences of the Peace, because Charleston was a radical, sympathetic household where he could be fully himself. He could think there, and he could write in opposition to the prevailing nationalism of the time. Vanessa's determination that she and Roger should remain friends when their sexual relationship came to a close, and we all know that doesn't work. But this determination is another example of Bloomsbury's determination to innovate in the relationships that it fostered, as well as through its books and through its art. So that was a difficult process between Roger and Vanessa. And when Roger visited Charleston in July 1918, he made both of these paintings. Those difficulties came to a head. He painted this portrait of Duncan and Vanessa that you see on the left at the breakfast table. Duncan reading the paper, Vanessa absorbed in her breakfast. On the table between them are Omega Workshops ceramics, a tall jug, a vase of flowers from the garden. Because I was curator at a house museum, I'm always asking the question, where is this painting set? And this painting is unmistakably in the garden room at Charleston, with the landscape by Vlaminck here that was exhibited in Manet in the Post-Impressionists and acquired by Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, and always hung in the garden room. So we know that this painting was definitely painted at Charleston. It was definitely painted in 1918 when Roger was out of sorts with Vanessa and Duncan. And it's not a happy scene. Roger was staying in one of the cottages down the road, and he felt excluded from Vanessa's domestic life. I think that's reflected in the painting. I think that the foreground space separates us from that couple at the table. We were absolutely not part of their intimate party. But I have to say, Roger is not painting Vanessa and Duncan having a great time over breakfast either, but then that's another thing. And Roger's letters are quite complainy. And Vanessa's letters to him invariably begin with an apology. That's the nature of their relationship after the split. So she wrote to him when he returned home to Durbins with a candour that was extraordinary between men and women in 1918. I don't know if you can imagine how men and women talked to one another during the First World War, but there was an absolute reserve in the way that conversations took place. And Vanessa here is trying to find a way forward, and I'm going to quote from her letter to Roger. She wrote that she was exhausted rather than indifferent to him when he visited, because she'd been moving furniture down from London, and she'd just had Clive, Mary, and Lytton all to stay. And in addition to that, she was 4 months pregnant. She wrote, "Why should you think I wanted to drop you, Roger? I told you as soon as I was no longer really in love with you, and I have always been quite honest with you about my feelings. Why shouldn't I be now?" She wrote that it was impossible for her to force herself to feel more than she did. But, she wrote, one can force oneself not to expect or even want much more than is freely given. And I think any good relationship depends in the end upon the one person being able to do that. At least I have found that that is what I have to do. And it seems to me probably always the case. And that reflects on the status of her relationship, this polyamorous relationship with Duncan Grant. The breakfast table may have been painted in situ at Charleston or from sketches soon afterwards, but it can be dated quite accurately to 1918. And as many of you will observe now, it allows us to date Summer in the Garden stylistically. We see the same clarity of design and simplification of form, the featureless faces. And Vanessa is wearing the same orange jacket in both paintings, and she's wearing blue stockings here rather than the mauve ones in Summer in the Garden. Well, Vanessa visited Roger at Durbins quite regularly between 1911 and 1919 when he sold the house. And he was reassured by her letters that she still cared for him, and he wrote to her that the thought of life without her was unbearable. He wrote, "I must go on loving you at whatever cost." Tragic. He invited her to stay at Durbins for a rest in September, while Duncan was taking time off from being an agricultural labourer and was going up to spend time with Maynard at 46 Gordon Square. The war was coming to an end, and Vanessa would go on to Gordon Square. She and Duncan were decorating her former studio for Maynard. It became his drawing room, and they needed to complete their decorations. They'd painted new panels for the double doors in the room. The furniture was being reupholstered. There were to be new curtains and cushions had all been ordered. But Vanessa slipped on the stairs at Charleston just before she went to stay with Roger at Durbins. And a few days after she arrived at Durbins, she feared she was having another miscarriage. She wrote to Duncan, and it's again revealing of the dynamic between them that she wrote to reassure him. And I quote, "You needn't be alarmed or worried about me when you read this, as though I've had rather a fright. There is every sign of things being all right now. There was some, but very little bleeding going on." The doctor had been called, she wrote, and she told Duncan that Roger thought that he should come to Durbins. He's the father of the child that she's pregnant with. But Vanessa thought that this would be too much of a bore for him. She didn't want to interrupt his fun in London. Instead, Clive and Mary joined them at Durbins, and Vanessa wrote that Clive his presence saved her reputation when the doctor was called, because she would have been compromised staying with Roger Fry and being seen to be alone with him when the doctor called. But Clive was her husband, even if he was visiting with his lover. So these are the circumstances in which Summer in the Garden was painted. Meteorological records, and incredibly they do exist, show that the weather was unseasonably cold in the latter days of Vanessa's visit to Durbin's. So Summer in the Garden may have been painted soon after she arrived, when she was resting before the suspected miscarriage. It seems probable, too, that the fabric draped across Vanessa's knees was destined for Maynard's new drawing room. The colours are compatible with this colour palette created by Vanessa and Duncan for Maynard, and we know from his letters to his mother that the room included new curtains, cushions, and upholstery. Well, as soon as she was better, Vanessa left Durbin's for 46 Gordon Square. She wasn't well enough to colour wash the walls with Duncan, as she had intended, but she lay on the sofa and directed operations as Duncan painted the walls. Roger visited Gordon Square a few days later. Duncan had been using Roger's London studio while he was in town, and he wrote to Bunny that Roger came for lunch at Gordon Square while they were decorating the drawing room. Virginia Woolf and Osbert and Sacheverell Sitwell came to tea, and they had a charming party. And then the following day, they all went to see Scheherazade at the Ballet Russe, and then on to a party at the Sitwells. Roger's sketch, Study of Vanessa Bell Reading, shows her propped up with brightly coloured cushions on a black sofa. The design of that sofa, I think, is revealing. It's unusual because the high back and arm are the same height. And that design matches a black sofa that Vanessa had in her studio at Gordon Square. Summer in the Garden, then, and the follow-up sketch, made in London by Roger, document a particular moment towards the end of the First World War and the complex relationship between Roger and Vanessa, an enduring and tenacious love between two friends that could accommodate Vanessa's new lover and her illegitimate baby. Vanessa's determination as a modernist to subvert conventional relationships, to insist upon the friendship that she wanted from Roger even after she had discarded him as her lover, and to be open with her husband about the subsequent loves in her life, underpins these two paintings. She set the terms for Bloomsbury's identity as a group, its candour about relationships, and its open acceptance of homosexual and polyamorous connections. Summer in the Garden encapsulates her strength and her understated influence as Bloomsbury's matriarch. Well, I'd like to turn now to Vanessa's more obvious achievements as an artist. And I want to do that through a close reading of her portrait of Mrs. St. John Hutchinson in the Rollins collection. Again, the stories surrounding the making of this portrait are illuminating. They reveal alternative relationships and the tolerance that made Bloomsbury exceptional. But here the painting is set at 46 Gordon Square rather than at Durbin's, and was painted in the first rather than the last months of the First World War. We know quite a lot about this painting from letters and diaries. Mary Hutchinson was 25 when it was painted, and Vanessa was 35. Mary had been married to the barrister St. John Hutchinson for nearly 5 years, and she was 7 months pregnant. She was also in the early months of a love affair with Vanessa's husband, Clive, that would last for over a decade. St. John didn't know about the affair for the first couple of years, but Vanessa did. Clive saw himself as a rake in the 18th century manner. He was a notorious womanizer, and as Vanessa could do nothing to stop his affairs, she insisted that they at least should be honest with one another about them. And that in itself, and still to some extent today, was progressive in the first decades of the 20th century. It strengthened her position when she too had relationships outside the marriage. In February 1915, when Portrait of Mary St. John Hutchinson was painted, she and Clive were still living together at 46 Gordon Square, and Vanessa and Duncan had recently become lovers. Vanessa wrote to Roger that Mary had stayed overnight following an evening of play reading when they'd read the different parts of Antony and Cleopatra. And it's interesting to speculate who might Antony have been and would Mary have been Cleopatra. So Vanessa and Duncan had both begun their portraits of Mary a day or two before, and Vanessa was waiting for her to come downstairs and for Duncan to appear when she wrote to Roger. She wrote, "She slept here last night, so she ought to be up soon," and she described their first sitting. Duncan got very desperate and began again, which I think I ought to have done too, but I didn't. It is a frightfully difficult arrangement, for I'm bang in front of her, and everything is very straight and simple and very delicate colour. Well, here on the right are two versions of Duncan's portrait, and it's interesting to speculate whether the larger and more detailed version or the smaller sketch in the centre was the discarded portrait. And I'm going to ask what your thoughts are about this. So how many of you think that Duncan started with that portrait on the right, and that's the one that he abandoned? How many of you think that? And how many of you think that the sketch in the middle is the first version by Duncan Grant? So interesting. And of course, we don't know. So one of the things that's interesting about these portraits is that they're not commissioned. Mary was invited to sit, just as Maynard and Lytton Strachey had been persuaded to sit to Duncan and Vanessa, so that they could experiment. It was an invitation to engage with post-impressionism, to be a party to Bloomsbury's incursion into modernism. Both Vanessa and Duncan were exploring abstraction when the portraits were painted, and in fact, Vanessa Bell was one of the first artists anywhere in Europe, in fact, anywhere in the world, to produce fully resolved abstract paintings in 1914. That is how important she is. And Vanessa later wrote that at this time she was interested in dissolving form. She wrote, "There was a great deal of excitement about colour then, and that her interest in trying to change everything into colour," I quote, "made me inclined to destroy the solidity of objects." I think you can see that so clearly in this portrait of Mary St. John Hutchinson. The pink flesh tones of Mary's face and neck are replicated in her abstract background setting, and in a subsequent version of the painting, the outline of the neck is eliminated. I'll show you that later, so that the face and background bleed into one another. In Vanessa's portrait and in Duncan's, Mary is seated in front of a large abstract composition with elongated rectangles set against a pink ground. And this has been mistaken for a wall decoration or screen. There's been a reluctance to accept how modern Vanessa Bell was, how innovative and progressive she was in creating these big abstract paintings. But its emphatic presence in this portrait and the flatness of the image as a component part of the colour harmonies in the composition suggests that Vanessa posed Mary in front of one of her recent abstract paintings, and that those abstracts were displayed at 46 Gordon Square. The clarity and the simplicity of the composition are compatible with the few surviving examples of Vanessa's abstract work, such as abstract painting that I show you here on the right. Vanessa's abstracts weren't exhibited during her lifetime, but Portrait of Mary St. John Hutchinson demonstrates that they were important enough to be displayed in the house. Vanessa was experimenting with the nature of portraiture in her painting of Mary. She was testing the boundaries of modernism. Here on the right, we see the influence of Rouault on her work. She reduces the face to a minimal assemblage of features in this profile of a man. 2 thick swipes of paint outline the nose, and 3 dashes, 2 horizontal and 1 vertical, frame the mouth. profile of man is sparing in colour. It explores Vanessa's pleasure in the material textures of paint, the mark-making and processes of painting, while Portrait of Mary St. John Hutchinson is about colour. So Mary was complicit in this experiment. And it isn't easy for us to imagine how shocking her outfit would have been in 1915, that yellowish green of her tunic. It was almost certainly bought together with the string of yellowish chrome yellow beads from the Omega workshops. One of the Omega workshop staff later recalled that when she went to Liberties of London in search of some emerald green silk, a rather haughty shop worker said to her, "Emerald, madam, is a colour we never stock," because it was vulgar. Bright colours, 1915, vulgar. But the Omega workshops dyed and block printed its own fabrics. And one of the most outrageous things about the linen tunics that it sold was their conspicuously bright and unusual colours. So clearly, you have to imagine Mary Hutchinson. She's going to stay overnight with her lover, but it's in, Vanessa Bell's home in 46 Gordon Square, and she's going to be painted by them. I mean, that's quite an intimidating prospect. So what does she pack? She packs the Omega Workshops linen tunic. But Mary is also an important patron of the arts in general, and one of the earliest customers of the Omega Workshops with her husband. So I started my talk this evening with the quip that you could tell by Vanessa's portrait of Mary that she didn't much like her. But in fact, the truth is more complex. Her portrait of Mary St. John Hutchinson was evidently accepted within the Bloomsbury Group as an important modernist portrait because it was another of the paintings that Vanessa hung at 46 Gordon Square. Clive wrote to Mary in October 1915, and I quote, "Your portrait, which looks humorously and rather sly over the back of my chair, seems to say yes, or at any rate, try." Well, a few months later, Vanessa included it in an important solo exhibition that she had at the Omega Workshops, and Clive wrote to Mary, "You are for sale at 7 guineas." Their avant-garde friends attending the private view would have recognized Mary, as well as Vanessa, as a pioneering modernist. There's no evidence that Mary was offended by this unflattering image with her bloated cheeks and the whites of her eyes painted blue. Clive wouldn't have described it to her hanging at Gordon Square if she had disliked it. And she was confident enough of her own beauty. Here she is on the right, in a photograph some years later by Cecil Beaton. Duncan and Vanessa painted Mary again when she and Clive visited them at Charleston. She modelled for an important painting by Vanessa that you see here on the extreme right, and that's a big painting you can see by the dimensions that I give you here. It's called The Tub. And she also modelled for this smaller portrait that you see in the centre, Vanessa Bell's study of a woman. Mary acquired a number of paintings by Duncan and by Vanessa, including that portrait. And like the 1915 painting, it reduces her eyes to slits with dots for pupils. The highlights and shadows of her flesh tones are chromatic experiments, and the discs behind her head reference her role as an Omega Workshops patron, their Omega Workshops plates, and Mary owned an Omega table, as well as the crockery to put on it. Vanessa and Duncan decorated Mary's home at around the same time that the portrait was painted, and when the interiors were published in Vogue, this portrait in the centre was prominently displayed in her inner drawing room. So there's every indication that she was party to these incursions into modernism. Roger bought Vanessa's 1915 portrait of Mary, and he included it in an important exhibition, The New Movement in Art, in 1917. Vanessa painted a second version. And this was not so unusual. She wrote that painting portraits was desperate work. Always, she wrote, when one has to stop, One thinks one sees how one could go on. Perhaps one ought then to do another from the original, or do one very quickly from life. So the second version was probably painted around 1919 when Vanessa was invited to exhibit with the London Group. And again, the painting is documented in her letters to Roger. She wrote to him in October 1919, I sent away my portrait of Mary to the LG, but I think I shall get into trouble over it. It's perfectly hideous now, and yet quite unmistakable. I asked her if she minded, and she evidently did, but I'd already sent it. And I believe it's rather conspicuously hung. However, I think it got better in the end. The inference in that last sentence, it got better in the end, is that Vanessa's primary objective was to carry on challenging the boundaries of modern portraiture, whether Mary was with her or not. The second version is more vivid, as you see. The lips are fuller and redder, and Vanessa painted green and blue highlights around the cheeks and chin. It's now in the Tate. Well, I've been telling you stories this evening about the relationships that underpin Vanessa's portrait of Mary and Roger's painting of Vanessa in the garden at Durbin's. And these narratives, I hope, contribute to a fuller understanding of these two very important paintings. They were conscious attempts by their artists to progress the cause of modernism in British painting. And that endeavour was supported and encouraged by the unconventional relationships within the group. E.M. Forster summarised the values that held Bloomsbury together in an interview for the BBC in 1958. He was committed, he wrote, to the importance of personal relationships, to tolerance, and to the importance of pleasure. Summer in the Garden and Portrait of Mary Hutchinson uphold those values. In the words of Virginia Woolf, they document moments of being. And in doing so, they draw us into a world in which difficult relationships could be examined with tolerance and fortitude, and even with pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's such an interesting question because the way that I work in archives a lot, and although there are over 300 published letters by Vanessa Bell, I transcribed another 1,500 or so. And I tended to work, so I would work through all of Vanessa Bell's letters to Roger Fry, then I would go to the Berg in New York and work through all of Vanessa's letters to Virginia Woolf. And she writes differently depending on who she's writing to. So she demeans herself in her letters to Clive Bell in the early years of their relationship in a way that I could feel my lip curling when I was transcribing, and I fully transcribe, not just the bits that are relevant to the work. So, you know, she might be writing about the weather or a bit of gossip about somebody being disinherited because he painted a nude with pubic hair, and then she'll talk about something that she's done. And so I fully transcribed them. And in doing that, I immersed myself into her world. But in combination with that, I have that sort of material engagement with her world, because for 12 years I worked at Charleston and my office was in her studio at the top of the house. So I know what her world smelled like. I know what it sounded like. I know the bird song, that you knew it was spring because the death watch beetle would start ticking upstairs in the attic, and you'd hear the flutter of the bats returning from France. So there's a sense of that. But when I worked at Charleston, we used to organise a new guided tour for Fridays, a specialist, a connoisseurs tour, we used to call it. And we used to write a new one every other year. And we wrote it collaboratively with the guides and with our PhD students. And we did one on sisters. And we give you little trigger points as you go through the house that you're thinking, oh, I can relate to that. And so you're halfway through the tour and you really think you know Vanessa Bell. You've got this sort of sense of ownership. She's in your team. And then we got up to the top studio. We played a short recording of her voice and Virginia's voice. And you suddenly go, whoa, these women are Victorians. Their accents are so plummy that you recognize that actually you don't know this woman at all. And E.M. Forster famously said, the past is another country, they do things differently there. So one of the things that draws us into Bloomsbury is the empathizing and being amused and being horrified by how bitchy they were about their friends. They would go and stay with Ottilie Morrell, and then they would be incredibly cruel about her. So we feel as though we know them, and there is nothing more intimate. I read 1,446 letters from Clive Bell to Mary Hutchinson, and they're his love letters to her. So of course, if you feel as though you have that intimate relationship with them, but at the same time you have to recognize that actually you don't, you live in a different century. So partly all the archive material, all the letters, then all the exhibition catalogues, but first and foremost the work with Vanessa Bell, because we didn't have a book on Vanessa Bell's work as an artist. And so I kept thinking, bring it back to the work. It's the work that really matters here. The life is interesting. It's very interesting, and she's important for the work that she achieved as a hostess, for the work that she achieved in holding that group together, for the work that she achieved in protecting her sister from going into a lunatic asylum. She's important for all those aspects of work as well, but primarily it is her painting and it's her decorative arts that we need to look at again. Before I wrote my book, I went to the Tate to see whether Vanessa Bell was really as good as anybody else of her generation. I thought, do I want to spend these years of my life looking at somebody whose work might not be good enough? And certainly she painted every day, so there are some paintings that are mediocre, but when she's good, she's as good as anybody. She's as good as anybody of her generation. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Why do you think that Oh, that's such a nice question. And yes, there certainly was. So the Omega workshops in 1913 to 1919, and in 1930, we begin to get these retrospective surveys of British interior design, British modern design. So there's the new interior decoration that Dorothy Todd and Raymond Mortimer publish. And Dorothy Todd had been the editor of British Vogue. And that's a very accessible book. But then you get the Architectural Review in England, which really says modernism is Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe's, Gropius, it's the international style. There is no space here for colour and decoration and furbelows. There's no sense here for humour and wit and cultural references. And there's no space here for women. And there's no space here for homosexual men. Modernism is, it's masculine stuff, and they set the terms. So they wrote the historiography of British design history of the early 20th century, and they begin doing that in 1930. And Pevsner becomes the big voice. He's the voice that's heard. But the Omega workshops comes from a different strand of modernism. So it comes from modernist painting. It's the decoration and design that painters evolve. So it belongs to a completely different tradition to the architectural tradition through the arts and crafts movement, through people like Lutyens and Voysey and Frank Lloyd Wright. You can trace them through to Gropius, but the Omega workshops just doesn't fit with that narrative. And so Pevsner dismissed it as an interesting experiment that was destined to fail. But in fact, when the Omega workshops closed in 1919, Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant immediately set up a design and decoration company. So they designed and decorated interiors, and they also produced product designs, which nobody had really paid any attention to until I wrote my book. So that's my answer. Long, sorry. Yes. People always ask about class with Bloomsbury because they're posh guys, aren't they? I mean, there's no two ways about it. They're upper middle class. She comes from a very educated background. Her father was the editor of the National Biography, the Dictionary of National Biography. Her mother was a great beauty that modelled for G.F. Watts and Edward Burne-Jones. When their parents died, Vanessa Bell and Virginia Woolf have a small independent income, but they're not rich. So they can pursue their ambitions to become a writer and an artist, but they must also earn money. So Virginia Woolf, for example, worked as a journalist all through her life. And until the mid-1920s, she made more money from her work as a journalist than she did as a novelist. And she had to do that work. So Bloomsbury it's one of the prejudices that's always raised against Bloomsbury is that they were posh boys and girls, and they were posh boys and girls. They went to the boys went to Cambridge, the girls were educated at home. They could afford to pursue their ambitions in the arts, but they weren't all that posh, and they were very hardworking, and they're always writing to one another about whether they can manage on 12 shillings a week. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't quite catch the very beginning of your question. Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think that what they're really interested in looking at is what a portrait has to be. I mean, it's very interesting that Vanessa Bell's portrait of Virginia Woolf, that little 1912 one, where she takes the features out, and yet it's such an intimate portrait. It tells you so much about her. So it's as if they're asking the question, I'm going to make a portrait. What happens if I take the features out? I'm going to make a portrait of Mary Hutchinson. What happens if I blend the outline and make the background and the face almost indistinguishable from one another? How can I test what a portrait needs to be? And what is the nature of portraiture in the modern age post-photography? So, and I think that the post-impressionists were doing the same thing. I think Cézanne is doing that. Certainly Matisse is doing that. They've always got half an eye on what Matisse and Picasso are doing, and that sense of reinventing yourself in the way that Matisse and Picasso were never consistent in the styles that they worked with. Yeah, so that they very often do capture a candid moment. I mean, I think the portrait that I showed you of Duncan Grant's portrait of John Maynard Keynes in the garden at Charleston, it's such an intimate portrait. And the Roger Fry portrait of Vanessa Bell, Summer in the Garden, again, it's about that. How could it not be about that relationship? But they're also looking at how they can move modernism forwards in their paintings. Yes. As absolutely, yes. I think they thought initially they thought of themselves as post-impressionists, and I think we have to recognise how shocking post-impressionism was. That Roger Fry organised Money in the Post-Impressionists in 1910. It was so reviewed in the papers. People were outraged by it. People stormed out of the exhibition and stamped on their catalogues. They were so infuriated by it. And so by saying we are part of European post-impressionism, they saw themselves very much as Europeans rather than in that sort of insular English tradition. So they saw themselves as post-impressionists, and that meant that they were radicals. So the book that I'm working on at the moment, which is about Bloomsbury networks, has a chapter on what post-impressionism represented in British culture and how formative it was for the whole of the Bloomsbury Group. Virginia Woolf wants to write in a post-impressionist way, because that is to be modern, that is to be anarchic, to be radical, and not to take anything at face value, but to challenge absolutely everything. So they absolutely see themselves as modernists, yes. Katie. Thank you so much for that. Yes, absolutely, they were competitive, and that you have to imagine them, the three of them, Roger, Duncan, Vanessa, shoulder to shoulder, all painting Lytton Strachey in the garden at Asham, or all painting Maynard Keynes, because Vanessa made that portrait too. And so there is that sense, it changes the power balance between the sitter and the artist, and it takes the power away from the sitter. Because there are three artists, and so the sitter is taking part in this experiment rather than, can you produce a good likeness of me? Will I like your painting? Will your painting be good because I think it's a good likeness of me? That's gone. So yes, they're competitive, but there's also the nature of their relationships also plays out in the way that they talk about one another's work. So Vanessa always heralded Duncan as the sort of the greatest English painter since Gainsborough, and their relationship depended upon the fact that she saw herself as always not quite as good as him, because Bloomsbury was open-minded about feminism and equality, but it wasn't that open-minded about it. And then she's mean about Roger's paintings. From the 1920s, she's really mean about Roger's paintings. And so the correspondence between her and Duncan and Clive, that Roger came and of course he brought his paintings with him, and he edged you into a corner where you had to say what you thought of them and how incredibly difficult it was because she wanted to be honest, but she didn't want to, yeah. So there are interesting power dynamics in that nature of competition. And there's competition too between Virginia and Lytton as writers. Virginia in her diary saying that it had taken Lytton 4 years to write Eminent Victorians, and was that not rather a long time to write 4 portrait sketches of these 4 figures, whereas Leonard had done so much more in the past 4 years. So, but it's the thing that that keeps them current, that makes them continue to be radical, even when they become mainstream, is that they're watching one another and they're sniping about one another. So they kept one another on their toes. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a question in regard to the panel.
The Ideal Home exhibition, the post-impressionist room in the Ideal Home exhibition.
Okay.
No? Am I?
The panels that look like they're a motif.
Yes. 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 So those panels were painted for the Ideal Home exhibition in 1913. The previous year, there'd been a post-impressionist exhibition, second post-impressionist exhibition organized by Roger, where he had borrowed Matisse's The Dance. The huge, exquisitely beautiful Matisse. So yes, they're always looking at what Matisse is doing. They go and see Matisse in Paris, and Clive Bell is a good friend of Picasso's. Yes.
please forgive me if you touched on this before. Absolutely everything is painted. Was that part of the theory, the philosophy, or they just found it?
Well, that's beautifully put. They're painters. They love paint. The portrait of a man in profile, you can just see that she's loving the texture of the paint, that material quality that paint has. When they decorate a room, they mix their own distemper from whiting, rabbit skin glue, water, and pigment, and then they color wash it. They invented, color washing, where you layer the colors on a wall. They invented it and let the colors run and have these vigorous brush strokes. So, yeah, it's
A theory of the mind that you should have no blank space.
they did have blank spaces. So if you go to Charleston, the corridors are pale grey, a sort of pearl grey colour, so that when you go into the rooms, then each room hits you with a freshness because your eyes have rested through these pale grey corridors.